Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening for this jointly sponsored event by the Pinsker Center and by the Oxford University Chabad Society. It's a real honor and pleasure to welcome everyone, everyone joining us from Oxford, from around the world. We look forward to a very interesting debate and discussion. Before we jump in, I'll just hand the floor to the Chabad Society student president, Michelle, who will say a few initial words of greeting.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's very special event brought to you by Oxford Chabad Society together with the Pinsker Center. Tonight, we will have the pleasure of tuning into a fascinating discussion with some high-level experts who will be assessing the foreign policy of the newly inaugurated Biden administration. So first, I would like to briefly introduce this evening's speakers before we proceed with the program. So chairing our discussion tonight is JOZEF, a politics tutor at St. Peter's College here in Oxford, who is also a senior research fellow at the Atlantic Council of the UK, as well as a research analyst at the NATO Association of Canada. JOZEF is also a former student and president of Oxford Chabad Society. We will also have the privilege of hearing from Dr. MELANIE GARSON, who is a mediator, lawyer, and a senior teaching fellow in international conflict resolution and international security at UCL. Last but not least, speaking to us tonight is Professor GIL TROY, a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, and an award-winning American presidential historian currently resident in Jerusalem. Professor Troy will also be speaking to us again later this term with Natan Sharansky. So now that the introductions are complete, I'm handing over to JOZEF to commence the chairing of our discussion this evening.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So I'll just give a few pointers on how the evening will proceed. First, we'll hear from Professor GIL TROY, who will give an outline of the legacy of the Trump administration, talk about some shifts that will happen under Biden, and dig into foreign policy implications for the Middle East in particular. Afterwards, we will hear from Dr. MELANIE GARSON, and finally, I will deliver some of my own analysis and remarks. After all three speakers, we will have a Q&A where we will open the floor to questions from all of our viewers, and the Q&A option is enabled, so we look forward to having a vibrant discussion following all of our remarks. All of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and then Q&A will be for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor GIL TROY to start us off. Thank you, Professor.
Good evening. Thank you for hosting me. Kvod Harav. Happy Tu B'Shvat. May this be a moment of renewal for democracies around the world, for the Jewish people all over the world, and for good people all over the world. It's a particular pleasure to speak to you tonight, although I have to say I feel a little unqualified because I'm a historian and the Biden administration is only a week old. So how much can I tell you? How much of an assessment can I really offer? So I'll start. I'm going to just share screen. Let's see if this works in order to share with some quotes from you with you to kind of get the conversation going. I'm going to try to avoid being too partisan tonight, but inevitably when talks about a new administration, inevitably when talks about presidential politics, one does end up touching on partisanship. Although I always try to tell my students, come in and let's talk about politics without being partisan. Can we put our partisanship on mute? But I think it's not all that controversial to say that the overwhelming majority of the American people, and the polls show between 55 and 70%, were thrilled a week ago to see the peaceful transfer of power. And it's something that we've always taken for granted until January 6th. And on January 6th, when we saw the violence, it was quite traumatic. And to me, one of the most moving moments of the inauguration last week wasn't Joe Biden's speech. No disrespect intended to him. Wasn't the poet, and wasn't the new vice president, no disrespect to them. But when Roy Blunt, a Republican senator from Missouri, who was a Trump supporter, who had actually raised questions publicly about the electoral count, nevertheless stood there as the co-chair of the inaugural committee and spoke about the peaceful transfer of power and spoke about a more perfect union, I said, that's it. That's what it's all about. And you'll see that I have my worries, I have my skepticism. My biggest concern, of course, is that we're talking about forecasting. And I think political forecasting is about as reliable as weather forecasting. But now I'm going to commit more heresy and break the celebration that's been going on, especially in universities around Joe Biden, and say that Joe Biden coming in didn't come in with the greatest reputation as a foreign policy superstar. And the one quotation that you hear again and again and again, I should say, until a year ago, when all of a sudden this orb surrounded him and the media decided that he was going to be, to use a Jewish concept, an etrog, a citron that one shouldn't touch. This is the quotation that always followed Joe Biden around since 2014, which is when Robert Gates, who was Secretary of Defense both in the George W. Bush administration and in the Barack Obama administration, had sat with Joe Biden and said, Joe Biden is a tremendously nice guy. I love the guy. And he's a man of integrity. But he has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. And in particular, what emerged from the Obama administration was that on that critical night when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, if you remember her, and President Obama, if you remember him, said green light to go after Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, the one who hesitated was Joe Biden. But Gates also went into more detail that during the final days of America's involvement in Vietnam, when the Shah fell in Iran in 1979, during the Reagan defense buildup, during the first Gulf War, when most of the American people were going up, Joe Biden was going down. When most of the people were going forward, he was going backwards. And I raise this not to disrespect to the new president, but to say 2 things. One is right now we're seeing this process because of so many people, especially in the media, so many people, especially in the university, being traumatized by Trump, that that Biden is getting a free pass and people are kind of forgetting that. But secondly, more interesting, is that Joe Biden was not elected because of his foreign policy chops. And Joe Biden isn't coming into office with a very clear vision of foreign policy, partially because the house is on fire. COVID. The house is on fire. The economy crating. The house, oh, but quite literally was almost on fire. The Capitol, January 6th. America is deeply divided. And notice, this is from President Biden's website when he was running, how he himself talks about foreign policy. In the Biden administration, America will lead by example, rally the word to meet our common challenges, but by 4th line, we're already at Donald Trump. So number 1, I am the un-Trump. And let's be honest, this is an old historic pattern. When George W. Bush came in, he said, I'm the un-Clinton. When Barack Obama came in, he said, I'm the un-Bush. When Trump came in, he said, I'm the un-Obama. So there's often a desire to distance yourself from your predecessor, but beware. Don't just do it instinctively. Don't just do it blindly. But more than that, notice how what he does, and you see it even clearer on the 2nd page here, he wraps around foreign policy and domestic policy. We're going to equip our people to succeed. This is from the foreign policy part of his website. We're going to equip our people to succeed in a global economy with a foreign policy for the middle class. So all of a sudden, I now have a foreign policy for the middle class. My foreign policy includes rebuilding the middle class, the backbone of the country. Because Joe Biden understood that if Tip O'Neill, the great Speaker of the House, once said all politics is local, that in 2020, 2021, all politics is domestic. All politics still is local. And foreign policy is something that you get to not 1st on the list, not 5th on the list, but 10th on the list. Except, and this goes back to the opening image of the weather forecasting, except when crises pop up again and again and again. And that's also, it's not only that I'm a historian and I fear making pronouncements, but I also know how much of any given administration's foreign policy is reactive. How much of a given foreign policy is simply responding to the unexpected. It happens obviously in domestic policy too, but because so much of foreign policy ends up being crisis-driven, the foreign policy is particularly sensitive to it. And it's ironic because we in the university love to get particularly theoretical when it comes to foreign policy. We love to come up with the theme and the theory behind anyone's foreign policy. But I would say in many ways that Joe Biden is really coming into office with gut instincts, which some people like, some people dislike, with a wealth of experience. He's been on the scene as a senator, as vice president, as a force in the United States since the late 1970s, but without a real foreign policy vision, without a real foreign policy tour, if I can use that word. In that vacuum, just yesterday, Bret Stephens of the New York Times comes up with a very interesting challenge. He says, I'm going to give you a foreign policy doctrine. Dissidents first. He has this wonderful statement about a dissident is to a dictatorship what a bull-faced lie is to an edifice of lies, the revelation of which can cause the whole thing to crumble. And he goes into detail, and he starts something very intriguing. He says, 30 years from now, what are we going to remember more? The mob of January 6th, which ultimately failed, which didn't succeed in harming the hair on a head of a member of Congress. Well, of course, we mourn the Capitol policeman who was killed and the others who died in the riots. But also, the constitutional process continued, the peaceful transfer of power continued. But what's going on in Moscow now? In Moscow now, Joe Biden is facing foreign policy crisis number one, unexpected crisis number one. With the return of Navalny to Russia, and I urge every single one of you to watch the video, the hour and 54-minute video, you don't have to watch the whole thing, that Navalny's people posted, not when he was in Germany, but once he arrived on Russian soil and was arrested. They had anticipated that. And we just have to be humbled by the power of these dissidents. This man flew back to Russia knowing that he'd be arrested, flew back knowing that his life may be worth less. But he said, it's only by doing that, by standing up, will my life be worth something, will my life have meaning. And so Bret Stephens says to Joe Biden, I know what you should do, a dissident's first foreign policy, reassert American foreign moral leadership, put human rights front and center. That links in to another article which is making the rounds in the Atlantic Monthly. And now we're going to go, and I'm going to emphasize, as Joseph said at the beginning, more the Middle East than any other part, is that when we talk about the Iran deal, many of these lessons I've been talking about, I would argue need to be applied. Number one, you might say yourself, yes, I want to be the un-Trump, but I might also have something to learn from the Trump administration when it comes to Iran, when it comes to recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish people, when it comes to breaking out of the box that had been so constricting for so long in Palestinian-Israeli negotiation, and seeing how the Abraham Accords created an end around. So one is, yes, you distance yourself from the abhorrent things of your predecessor. You distance yourself from the differences in principle you had with your predecessor, but don't just do it instinctively, just don't do it automatically. Secondly, when we talk about Iran, we should put human rights front and center. And third, when we talk about Iran, we should read this article, which goes into really specific and thoughtful detail about the nature of the Iranian threat, the nature of the JCPOA, the treaty. It wasn't a treaty, it was an agreement because Obama couldn't get it past the Senate, the agreement with Iran, and shows the blind spots. So that even if Trump didn't quite pull off what he hoped and send the Iranian nuclear project back the 20 years that he was hoping for. And even if Joe Biden is coming in with all kinds of people, from Wendy Sherman to Anthony Blinken, who were somewhat involved in the Iranian negotiations and take some pride in it, learn from this article and learn from the blind spots. Learn from the things that Iran exploited in the JCPOA, and learn from some of the things that America missed. And it's not only this article goes into detail about what was missed technically in terms of the arms deal, but to me, one of the biggest issues was that there was no pressure on Iran to start being a good citizen of the world. There was no pressure on Iran to stop with its rhetoric, its genocidal rhetoric that's not only against little Satan, Israel, but big Satan. You know what big Satan is? The United States of America. Why would we tolerate that? And he said that the Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and Yossi Klein Halevi, the great writer, say that JCPOA allowed Iran to maintain its nuclear program and revitalize its economy. Iranian people have to have a choice. Do you want a healthy economy? Then you can't go ahead with the nuclear project, the rush to go nuclear. And they show, especially given the Israeli intelligence successes in bringing documents, massive documents, back to Israel and sharing them with the Americans, just how much the Iranians were lying and how much progress they were making on the Iran, on their rush to go nuclear, even during the period. And the final dimension of this challenge to Biden has to do with, as I already mentioned quickly, the Palestinian conflict, which is that Donald Trump showed the value of breaking out of the box. He showed the cost sometimes of being too disruptive. He showed the cost of breaking out of the box. But when it comes to the Abraham Accords, and when it comes to getting out of the impasse, and I'm not just talking about the impasse between Israelis and Palestinians, I'm talking about the impasse where American policymakers and many of their British counterparts and the European counterparts and their UN counterparts couldn't get out of the box that was created with the Oslo negotiations in 1993 and weren't even able to say the word failure. And if you can't say, it failed, you can't learn what might be a possible success. And so the most important thing is for Joe Biden to lead his team forward, not just be reactive against Donald Trump, not just be caught in the old policies of yesterday, but to really think in a new creative way, not just for the sake of the world, but also for the sake of Americans, how to have a thoughtful, innovative, moral, human rights-based foreign policy. And unfortunately, the comment that was made by the US ambassador to the United Nations smells very stale, smells very Oslo. And I would like to assign yet another article for Joe Biden and for you to read, which is in today's Atlantic Monthly. Micha Goodman talks about shrinking the conflict. He says, let's stop looking for the perfect answer between Israelis and Palestinians. We'll get to that. First, let's say, is there some way of giving the Palestinians more autonomy? Is there some way of giving the Palestinians a better economy? Is there some way of minimizing the misery, maximizing functionality? And once we do that, as with the Abraham Accords, we'll start building those personal ties that work. So am I willing to give an assessment? Am I willing to give a report card this early in the administration? No. But am I willing to give a challenge? Think out of the box. Think creatively. Learn from past mistakes that Democrats have sometimes made. Learn from past successes that Republicans may have made, and go forward. And hopefully bring peace to this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor GIL TROY. That was fascinating. Thanks so much for giving us a broad overview of the strategic shifts, assigning some good reading recommendations. We'll now pass the floor to Dr. Melanie Garson, who will speak for about 15 minutes. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Pinsker. Thank you, Oxford Chabad as a whole. And that is without a doubt a tough act to follow. But as a political scientist, as not a historian, unfortunately, my mandate is to be looking at trying to be the prophet and not always succeeding, but trying to integrate it with a little bit of practical insight as well. And as Professor Troy has so eloquently pointed out, the Biden administration stepped into a hugely different foreign policy context than President Biden himself has seen in all his careers or engagement with foreign policy. As all of his team of experts, so from Tony Blinken, from Greenfield, Sullivan, Wendy Sherman, they're all absolutely superb and experts in their field and very much looking into this expert-led foreign policy field. And with a frame that priority is without a doubt domestic, pandemic, thinking about the vaccination rollout, dealing with the very, very critical need to heal fractures within society, strengthening institutions that have been moved away from it, and really dealing with all the economic impacts. So a $1.9 trillion sort of care package going into the US means that any money to fight far-flung wars is not going to be on the agenda. And then at the very heart of, if we're looking at the messages that President Biden has been putting forward today, at the very underpinning of foreign policy going forward, will be trying to do this from a very bipartisan basis. So he's trying to, in order to heal wider America, the steps that he's going to be taking domestically and on a foreign policy basis are going to, I would imagine, be with this overriding sense. And I think that's really important. So when we begin to look at the messaging that's coming out from Biden himself, from Tony Blinken, as really looking at, for start, restoring leadership in the same way that we're seeing domestically, is this image of restoring leadership, restoring faith in US leadership globally, restoring faith in US leadership as moving away from a transactional style of leadership to a values-based leadership again, re-engaging with alliance, re-establishing credibility, re-establishing reliability, but re-establishing that an agreement can be made and it's not going to everybody wake up to a time bomb on Twitter the next morning. It's really working with allies and working to be that hand in being part of what the US was for the last 75 years, about being part of setting the rules, about setting the norms, about almost trying to return some of that unique US role, mobilizing the global community back into action. And I think that's very much the frame that is sort of the undertone from what we're seeing from the speeches coming out of Washington at the moment, from the foreign policy leadership. And it's, I mean, the return to the Paris Agreement as one of the very first steps being taken, re-engagement with NATO. And none of this doesn't mean that there won't be disagreements. It doesn't mean there won't be disagreements with key allies, that we're seeing the immediate sigh of relief that NATO allies, the European Union, but that disagreement, certainly among the allies, will not be in the same adversarial frames that it has been to date. But I think, so one of the criticisms or one of the worries that's being leveled at the communities as a whole, that being looked at it, is we have to some extent a sense of an old guard foreign policy expertise coming in is that, what does that mean, and what is the danger that lies in that? And I think there is an extent that Olgard, and actually Tony Blinken in a speech in Chatham House before he was sort of came on board, actually said this sense of they don't want to go backwards, you need to go forwards. And I think this is an important thing, that you can never turn back the clock in foreign policy. There's no sort of pressing a reset button and we can start again. And we have to sort of go beyond, look forward, and they have to engage in the world that they find it, not the world that they wish it was, not the world that it was 4 years ago, but quite a fractured and divided world that attention is all sides and fighting a very real common enemy in COVID. And doing that with sort of a US position coming from humility, coming from the position that the world is not US centric, that this is, so I think what Martha called it a few weeks ago, sort of without the strategic narcissism that can sometimes be occupy US foreign policy, and with a different sort of attitude to being, there's much healing to be done. So where does this start? And we have a very complex and interrelated set of challenges, from looking at the pandemic, from our global health crisis, global climate crisis, to also sort of active measures, so coming from Russia and China, the rise in China, the eye on Latin America as well. So, and that's related to China's hand in Latin America, China's hand in Africa, an area that Trump administration very much didn't look at. And of course, sort of the entrance to the Middle East and other arms control regimes. So where the Biden administration has needed to gear quickly, climate change back into the Paris Agreement, START treaty that was that had to be sort of reestablished, and get onto the phone to Russia, that will be done. But for the rest, for the moment, it's going to take a time for the whole team to go through all the Senate hearings, through all the confirmation hearings, to get through into that process, that the team is in place to deal with these complex interrelated measures. Now, I think what we're seeing is good signaling, and this is a seat of experts, strategic experts that understand foreign policy, and they also understand the nature of transitions and the danger of transitions. And what we're not seeing, and which is it's sort of comforting to some extent, is there's not, with the new administration, necessarily a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater on the foreign policy scene yet. So there's not a sense of, well, we're the non-Trump, so therefore we're going to get rid of everything we've done. And a good example of that is with Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, the treaty last year, the process of implementing that has not run smoothly. The administration has taken the decision to keep on the special envoy that Trump approved, Khalizad, to keep on overseeing that process. And that kind of move is shrewd, it's clever, it shows that actually they're not operating on petty grievances here. It's not about it. This is for a greater good approach. And if that is a small symbol of what we're going to see with the transition to foreign policy, it points to some good approaches. Of course, as Professor Troy is aware, one of the big issues everybody's thinking about is the JCPOA, is Iran, and what are the different approaches to it. And I think it was very interesting that I had Ted Deutsch and Dennis Ross speak in different forums yesterday, and they both came out with actually the same words, and actually both of them, again, not, whilst the Trump approach has not, as Professor Troy pointed out, yielded the expected results that we would like to see. necessarily, that there are some elements that could be used, but what ultimately has failed is that whilst the sanctions regime has hit Iran economically, it's not led to the change of behavior. So when we're in foreign policy terms, when we're looking at compellence, if we're looking from that larger framework, it's not yielded what they were hoping for. And how do you best re-engage? And there's a huge opportunity here. And whilst we do have some of the negotiators and thinkers of the JCPOA and government, there's a huge opportunity for them to actually be able to step away, reshape policy, while saving face and not necessarily sort of having to admit how far they may have been off base with the original agreement. And what was really interesting is the messaging coming out, and I think Tony Blinken said this, is compliance for compliance. And I think an interesting approach to look at is that of Dennis Ross. And Dennis Ross originally in the Washington Post and for the Washington Institute, he published a really interesting paper on how to look at it. And certainly if there's anyone that's expert in dealing with the Middle East, I think his voice is one that's worth hearing. And he talked of, rather than thinking of a compliance mechanism, is a less for less mechanism. We know that the Iranians have hit that 20% point that is the Israel red line. And he frames looking at Iran from a much wider perspective, it's not just about Iran and the nuclear issue, we've got the ballistic missiles issue, we've also got their wider involvement in regional destabilization and human rights abuses, which is the perspective that the Professor Troy also is building into this. And from the from Dennis Ross's perspective, I think is really interesting is the splitting this out. That the US can still take action of splitting out the nuclear deal from the action that needs to be taken on the other side. And it's really interesting from his less for less approach comes from a point of thinking about, well, the US has got $100 billion worth of frozen Iranian assets and accounts. Instead of sort of looking for these compliance, we want to, because sometimes that can lead to a stalemate. Who goes first? What do you do first? How do you go to this step-by-step approach? And sort of making these demands on both sides is saying, well, you take a step, you start reducing, you start dismantling the centrifuges, and we will release a little bit of the account. Now, the value of this sort of strategy it's a strategy that will still keep some sort of bipartisan consensus, because within that strategy, it's not removing the sanctions, but it's allowing for some phased re-engagement. And I think it's sort of that level of thinking and new approaches to add into what we have in this arena that's important. I think there's huge opportunities for this administration to go after seeking aspects such as that there's been long looking for arms control approaches throughout the Middle East to build upon the arms control regimes of potential that can come out of the Abraham Accords for an integrated defense policy within the Middle East. There's huge opportunity there. And with just a very quick note on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, again, I think this is going to be a lot further down the agenda than it's perceived to be the importance, and a lot of within that, I think there will be a relook into how to provide levels of aid back again. I don't think, and I would probably say I don't think it should be through automatically reigniting the relationship with UNRWA, but a far more, funds are precious, to the US right now, as they are to everyone. If they're going to be giving funding, that should be looking more in return for what should active institution building, removing of corrupt governance within Palestinian society, and really so that it can be used for the right sort of rebuilding and provisions, and not just funneling it into through different agencies without a hand on that. And one final word, that within all this picture, and I can always expand and go, I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A, is Iraq. Often when we're looking, everything is, you know, we're sort of framing on one side of Iraq and the other side of Iraq with a view to also thinking about sort of Yemen and Libya and the other humanitarian crises in the Middle East. But Iraq it was still critical. US engagement to work on the governance sector to support the building of the governance within Iraq will become critical, and that is in counterbalancing Iran. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis has led to ISIS, non-state actors in the Iraq-Syria region being able to gain greater traction because governments have been busy elsewhere, and stabilizing Iraq, you know, when the never-ending wars, is going to also be critical in finding this balance. So those are I think my 15 minutes is up, but I'm happy to answer any questions as they come on board.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Melanie Garson. And I think there's some common shared themes between Professor Troy and Dr. Garson's remarks. Most notably, the idea that on the one hand, you have a sort of foreign policy team of experts, a sort of desire to return to multilateralism, to sort of re-embrace the old guard foreign policy mentality. But on the other hand, this great opportunity for stepping outside the box, and the present reality, which is so distinct from what things were 4 years ago. And the necessity to engage with that present reality. And thanks so much also for giving us a highly detailed analysis of the Dennis Ross proposal, the Biden administration's likely engagement in Afghanistan, Iraq as well, an issue that is rarely touched upon but is critical. I'd like to start my remarks by jumping in on some of the themes articulated by both our speakers. And I'd like to sort of specifically focus on the Biden administration's plausible approach to an Iran nuclear deal, as well as the Biden administration's plausible approach to new diplomatic relations and new developments in diplomacy in the region. But in a way that segues off of the developments that the Trump administration has pushed forward, so as to, as Professor Troy mentioned, build off of the legacy of the Trump administration, not simply to deny it. I think one thing is clear. Iran is in a place where they desire desperately to renew some sort of nuclear deal. President Rouhani came out with a statement, and he claimed that sanctions, the maximum sanctions campaign, has cost Iran over $200 billion worth in lost foreign income. Mohammad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, came out with an article recently, January 22nd, in Foreign Affairs, effectively pleading for the world, for the global community, for the United States to return to the quote-unquote Iran deal that Iran made. The maximum pressure campaign, broadly speaking, was effective in terms of what it was designed to do. It was designed to cripple the Iranian economy more so than it has been before. Unemployment is high, inflation is high. Iran is running out of foreign exchange. Before 2018, Iran was exporting 2 million barrels of oil a day. And now that figure is 300 to 500,000, and most of the oil exports have been going to China, not necessarily a stable long-term partnership. All of that is to say that Iran is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they desire to sit down and engage some sort of new deal. Now, I agree with both the assessment of Professor Troy and Dr. Garson. It would be a mistake to return to the pre-Trump administration approach to Iran. It would be a mistake to give the Iranians what they desire, to re-engage and to simply copy-paste the old agreement anew. And that's critically because the old agreement was, for all intents and purposes, quite weak in a number of areas. Most importantly, there was nothing in the old agreement that addressed Iran's malign behavior in the region above and beyond its nuclear ambitions. Iran, of course, has notable terrorist proxies, Hezbollah in Syria, in Lebanon, in Libya, in Yemen, and the old nuclear deal did nothing to address that. Neither, by the way, did the Trump administration. The Trump administration did not go after Iranian proxies in the region. And so I think as a first order of business, if the Biden administration wishes to sit down with Iran and to negotiate some sort of deal, what would make sense is for the administration to leverage the maximum economic pressure that the Trump administration has placed on Iran, leverage that to gain a better negotiating standpoint and to seek some sort of agreement on the decline of Iran's malign influence in the region, particularly with regards to the funding and training of proxies. But also another aspect of the old agreement that needs to be rectified in any new agreement is the absence of a clause that deals with Iranian missiles. You know, it's one thing to have the materials ready for nuclear fission and production. It's another thing to have missiles which are able to carry out, God forbid, some sort of attack. And so any renegotiated agreement must address critically the Iranian capacity to develop warheads, nuclear warheads, which has gone on without any distraction and has continued to progress over the last few years. Now, moving on from Iran and into the broader region, I think another legacy of the Trump administration, quite a remarkable legacy, that the Biden administration would do well to jump on and to develop, has been the 4 Israeli-Arab peace agreements, which constitute the single greatest, I think, geopolitical and diplomatic achievement in the region since the Israel-Egypt and Israel-Jordan peace agreements in the 90s and the 70s. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, but also peace agreements with Morocco and with Sudan. I think these agreements have massive positive implications, not only for security and for stability in the region, for projecting, as Dr. Garson mentioned, some sort of conception of a multilateral security consensus in the Middle East. But more importantly, these agreements have positive implications for the economy, for general diplomatic relations, for international development, for environmental protection, for energy reform, moving away from traditional oil and natural gas into hydrocarbon resources. There are vast implications at play here, and I think all of them largely positive. And the Biden administration would do well to invest in maintaining positive momentum that the Trump administration has given to these agreements. One more thing on this point. The Trump administration also was itching in some ways to establish a 5th peace agreement. That, of course, is the much talked about, rumored peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Again, I think that the Biden administration would be very wise to press forwards with that. And there is some indication that they will. There's also a lot of indication that they might approach things in a more hesitant manner, and I think that would be a mistake. But that being said, as Dr. Garson mentioned, the Biden administration is filled with foreign policy experts, people who have been around in DC for decades, and it is unlikely that these experts, people like Antony Blinken, would approach things in sort of an old guard manner without taking into account the new realities of the Trump legacy. I think in general, the Biden administration has a lot to gain. It has a lot to gain by learning from the achievements of the Trump administration, but also has a lot to gain by moving away from some of the weaknesses of the Trump foreign policy approach. And here I again agree with the remarks of the previous two speakers. The main weakness, of course, of the Trump administration has been failing to take a more engaged approach on certain issues. Certainly on Syria, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, there was some progress, although that remains to be seen how things will develop. And so it seems like the Biden administration is going to take a more active approach, is going to return to this conception of America as a lead player in the world, a world set by rules, governed by institutions that America largely protects and defends, and that all seems positive. But fingers crossed, this is all projection. This is also sort of a normative assessment on my part, and we'll see how things develop. Now, as a final point, I'd just like to say that we've now opened the floor to questions. We have a variety of questions from participants, viewers from all over the world. And the questions are actually addressed to all of our speakers. So I will present some of the questions and then we can go through them briefly and answer them in the same order, Professor Troy first and myself last. So we have the first question is from Rowena Lee, and Rowena Lee has talked about, Rowena Lee is asking about the climate change process and the impact of climate change in supporting peace, cooperation. And particularly, it's an interesting point, particularly implications of climate change on food provision and food supply change. Whether the Biden administration plans to develop foreign policy in this direction in any way. You know, the foreign policy for the middle class should focus on nutrition and food and sort of international development. So I suppose to expand that question a little bit, do we have any thoughts on the Biden administration's approach to international development and how that relates to the climate change process?
Thank you, and thank you for those illuminating presentations. Dr. Garson used a wonderful phrase, strategic narcissism, and I think this is very, very important. Here, the American on the call has to point out just how true it is. When he talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, he's talking about a foreign policy for the American middle class, and I appreciate the idealism of the questioners and the people on the call who want the most important thing for the United States to be thinking about is food supply for others. But what he was really trying to say is, I'm going to have a proactive foreign policy. I'm going to have a non-Trumpian foreign policy. I'm going to have an idealistic foreign policy in order to help you in Boise, Idaho, and to help you in Butte, Montana, to help you in New York City, to help you, the Americans. So that's number one. Nevertheless, I appreciate this question and many other questions because it also reminds us, you know, just how vast a subject foreign policy is and how overwhelming the job is of the American president. Let's take one of the smartest men, you may love him or hate him, but one of the smartest men to ever be president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. And I was at a conference at the Carter Center a couple of years ago, and we historians were given the opportunity to pitch questions to him. He gave a little talk, and then we each gave questions, submitted questions based on the papers that we had written. And people started asking him one question after another after another. At a certain point, he said, you know, this was already 12 years ago. every day in the presidency is overpacked. He says, I just don't remember my fair housing policy. I just don't, and it was if Dan Quayle or somebody like that had said, oh my goodness, what a dummy, right? He was the vice president under George H.W. Bush, who was known for putting quotation marks as a dummy. But Jimmy Carter, the super smart man. So we see, in our presentations, we didn't talk about the China threat, which of course was a very major issue with Donald Trump. We didn't talk about the whole question of immigration and borders in South America. Dr. Garson mentioned it very briefly. So yes, in an ideal world, someone like Joe Biden, someone like the Democrats would come in with a foreign policy that is very much oriented toward feeding the world. And by the way, that's been one of the secrets of American success, America being the breadbasket of the world. He has put climate change front and center, and as was mentioned, return to the Paris Accords. But we should just emphasize the complexity, the overwhelming nature of the job, and the fact that, again, the domestic needs, especially in this moment of crisis, come first.
Thank you, Professor Troy. Dr. Garson, some thoughts?
Thank you for that question. It is a hugely important question, especially when we're framing foreign policy, national security, international security from a human security standpoint. And in the end, it's when we look at these different framings, the US has had a focus through their global security, Food Security Act, through their Feed the Future sort of programs. The Global Food Security Act is coming up for renewal in a few years' time. And 2023, I think, but they have been committed to looking at improvement of agriculture, rural agriculture. The first step back into that is the Paris Agreement. Is inextricably linked to climate change. It's linked to a vast array, and this is where I mentioned earlier the interconnectedness of foreign policy and the time it's going to take for those teams to get into place. To be able to look at it. There's a huge food insecurity problem right now in the US that's linked to the COVID crisis, and that needs to be addressed. But externally, this also involves, in today's world, having integration with cyber protection, so with the wider, so making sure that global food supply chains are secure from any sort of interference from electronic digital threats, which is also something that's sort of a little bit out of the scope of what we're thinking about. But as Professor Troy pointed out, foreign policy is huge. So securing global food supply chains comes from looking at the climate. It comes from ensuring that we have cooperation on those cyber norms that are going to protect those sorts of chains. Part of what we're seeing driving, and this is why support for things like the Abraham Accords is there, part of what underpinned the UAE and Israel's informal cooperation for the 12 years preceding the actual signing of the Abraham Accords is Israel's ability to recycle water. And in a sort of, I think they are one of the world's leaders in actually being able to recycle water. I think 90% of water in Israel is about recycled. Now, the next leader down from that is about Italy, where they can recycle about 17%. So and part of it in an area ridden by drought, which has that in a global warming crisis, has that potential for food insecurity. These kind of agreements and protecting these kind of agreements and building on them where sort of technologies for food security, looking at different types of digital protections, blockchain, smart contracts for food supply chain contracts will be, I think, all part of this wider vision that needs to be led. But for the initial basis of the Biden administration, food security begins at home.
Thank you, Dr. Garson. My own remarks will be very brief. I think the Biden administration has put forward a very competent future head and head of the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and that, of course, is former ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. Samantha Power, of course, has great experience dealing with many international crises, both diplomatic as well as international security crises. And Biden, in his appointment of Samantha Power, stressed the importance of USAID and of the United States in general in supporting both climate, the climate change process, as well as resurrecting the sort of traditional approach to U.S. International development, moving away from sort of a reliance on traditional natural resources, trying to move towards sustainability more broadly, globally. And I think that will be a particularly important challenge now in the post-COVID space. Samantha Power, of course, has mentioned that there needs to be some sort of global response to COVID-19, some sort of international response that addresses the many economic challenges that we will face for years to come as a result of this crisis. Quickly on this point of Israel and the UAE, one of the exciting implications of the Abraham Accords, I think, is the ability to see some sort of agreement and diplomatic momentum on moving away from traditional natural resources and towards more sustainability in the energy space. Both Israel, of course, and the UAE have traditionally had problems, as Dr. Garson mentioned, with desertification, water supply, and there seems to be a great opportunity for the UAE to learn from Israel's expertise in this area. And the UAE in particular, on the other hand, has also been putting lots of money into hydrocarbon research, trying to move away from traditional oil and natural gas towards more innovative solutions, and trying to also sort of diversify from a traditional economy. So I think in general, strengthening economic links in the region, strengthening trade, foreign direct investment between allies will bring us in that direction. Now, shifting gears a bit to a topic that Professor Troy mentioned, we have a question from my colleague Elliot Smith. And Elliot is asking, what will the Biden administration do about China? Will the Biden administration stick with the sort of Pompeo-Trump approach to China? Will it return to the way things were before? China is the big elephant in the room. Very quickly, I mean, we could have an entire seminar on China, but what do you reckon will be the approach of the new administration?
I think this is also a point where there has been a sort of crossing of the Rubicon, and I don't think that the optics will and the politics will allow Biden to go back to the Obama, Clinton, Bush, let's make it bipartisan approach, which was to just kind of let China grow and grow and grow and not confront China. And I think the pressure on Biden to show that I'm learning from the Trump administration, but going forward and doing it in a more thoughtful, systemic, disciplined way will be seen, particularly in China and in Iran. And if I can just add one more line about Iran, what's really interesting is that both sides agree that Iran wasn't in compliance. The pro-Trump side says, you see, that's why we had to break the accords, because they were cheating already. And the anti-Trump side says, you see, we didn't put the pressure on, and that's why they're not in compliance. And that's also one of the challenges, and it touches obviously on domestic policy too, that in a world where, look, there have always been different perceptions, but in a world where people can't even agree on the basic facts, and they argue about what's really happening, you then start getting differences over interpretation and differences over policy.
Melanie?
I think what Professor Troy has said that is right. The general sense is that there's little movement for sort of directly addressing with China. I think part of the quote that was put up about foreign policy for the middle class is also Biden's commitment to continuing to protect US jobs and from protecting from intellectual property theft. From the digital sphere, there's going to be an increased look at China is developing its interference, its active measures capabilities. It's still not anywhere near a class act as it on that sphere as Russia is, but there were Chinese attempts at interference into the elections. There will be continued look at it. And I think that engagement from the foreign policy sphere, again, will be looking at countering Chinese influence in Latin America is a big area that will be on the agenda. And again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's sort of re-engaging and looking at where the balance of power is beginning to sit with China rising in its engagement in Africa, as well as sort of traditionally looking at the South China Sea. There's been talk about the much more looking for a role for where Taiwan sits and sort of supporting greater engagement with Taiwan. And again, on the human rights basis, it's going to be looking at to what's happening in Hong Kong and how that has to be measured from the human rights agenda. But I think it's sort of slowly so. But I think the one thing that's important is I think there's China, and I think the census had a huge responsibility when COVID broke out, and a responsibility to the international community, that the sense certainly that from the international community and from the US, it's China deeply sort of failed on their sense of global responsibility. There was an opportunity to let in people to have a look at it, to originally let the WHO in, to really be transparent, and they failed the global community on that. And I think there's a lot of mistrust that exists on that level that there's needs to be built up for China to regain some of that sense of where they need to be, or how they're perceived on the global stage from a moral responsibility factor.
Thank you, Dr. Garson. I think just to like to build off of that comment, one of the great fault lines, in my view, in my analysis, in the Pax Americana, is the Chinese engagement with Europe. This is something that very few foreign policy experts, analysts are discussing, but I think it's a growing fault line, and it's a growing fissure in traditional alliances. We saw that over the 5G issue earlier this year, when the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg came out publicly and mentioned the potential security threats, implications of Chinese investment in building of 5G networks across NATO allied states, all across Western Europe. And yet, despite these public remarks and warnings, we saw a vast array of responses among NATO allies. And even here in the UK, we saw, well, initially the response of the UK government was, well, we'll try to work something out, or we'll permit Huawei to build some sort of network, but they won't have access to this particular data. And then, maybe we can court some sort of other network provider as well. And to this day, there still seems to be some sort of disagreement over the issue. I think moving forwards, the Biden administration would be wise to try to establish some sort of cross-allied inter-alliance approach to China and to Chinese foreign direct investment in particular in other NATO allied countries. The Trump administration tried somewhat to move in this direction, but of course this goes above and beyond simply a sanctions policy. I think there needs to be some sort of overarching grand strategic approach to China on behalf of NATO allies and pushed by the United States. And so this is an area that the Biden administration, I think, would be wise and could certainly provide significant value add for the world at large. I have another question from colleague Daniel Palin. Daniel is asking somewhat more of a theoretical question. What can be done to restore some civility in discourse, both domestically and internationally? McConnell talked about democracy falling into a death spiral. Von der Leyen has talked about how much damage to democracy has been done recently. There's various conspiracy theories floating around about the election, about COVID. How can we return to some sort of civilized democratic discourse?
I always like to quote my Rebbe on this, the former New York Mayor Ed Koch, who said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. The notion that if I'm a Republican, I have to agree with every single thing the Republicans ever said and hate the Democrats. Or if I'm a Democrat or a member of the Labor Party or whatever, I have to go completely whole hog is toxic. So that's number one. There has to be a kind of mind shift where we go back to the complexity of politics. We go back to making fun of our own, making fun and disagreeing with Joe Biden, even if I voted for him, or Donald Trump, even if I voted for him. That's number one. Number two, social media obviously plays a toxic role here. And I actually do a little experiment every now and then. Just last week, I did this again. I get some toxic attack from somebody. You're an embarrassment. How can you write this? And I write back the most polite, what my mother would have called menschdicke letter. And it's never happened to me that they go round two and they escalate. And it's happened to me repeatedly that they de-escalate, say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. In this case, the person said, I ran away with myself. It's the same reason why when you drive around your neighborhood, you're extra careful not to cut people off because you might be cutting somebody off who recognizes you. The anonymity of the internet feeds the bullying and feeds the toxicity. And that requires a different approach. And so we need to agree and not just agree to disagree. And the third thing, I mean, I could go much longer because I've spent a lot of time on this, is I think we've really seen an interesting experiment this with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I could point out all the different ways that Joe Biden has gussied up, has masqueraded really quite far left policies with his rhetoric. But the fact that he has set a tone of decency, has set a tone of unity, has set a rhetoric of the soul of America. And not only that, but in his inaugural address, he said, my goal is to be president of all the American people, which Donald Trump never tried to do and never spoke about. So words matter. I'm calling this that there's the visible presidency, which is the constitutional functions, the formal policies, and there's also the invisible presidency. The invisible presidency is the tone setting. The invisible presidency is the niceties. The invisible presidency is an approach that understands that leadership isn't just what we've been talking about, which is the meat and potatoes and the policies and the, but it's the morals behind it, it's the ethics behind it, and it's the attempt, especially in a democracy, to understand that ultimately a democracy is a leap of faith. And if we don't build up the legitimacy, and if we don't build up the decency, if we don't build up the sense of we're a community, we're lost. And on this, in the United States, I'm calling out the Democrats as much as I'm calling out the Republicans, because the vengefulness that we're hearing among many Democrats, the fury, and I understand where it comes from, but we have to remember that vengeance ultimately poisons the communal well. We all drink from the same water fountain, and if we have a politics of demonizing anyone who dared to disagree with us, demonizing anyone who dared to support Donald Trump, and if we buy into the delusion that Donald Trump fed, that now Democrats are buying, that 75 million people voted for me, as if they voted as one block. When we know that any given time somebody's voting for somebody, especially in the binary American system, there could be 32 or 37 or 45 different reasons. And to treat them as one block, either as a block of power that Trump very cleverly and demagogically tried to build as part of his illusion, or as a block of evil, as too many Democrats are talking about, is toxic for democracy.
Well, I can only echo so much of what Professor Troy had said. And I think just to build on that a little, and often I mentioned earlier, the sort of counterbalance for strategic narcissism is for what we call strategic empathy. And I think the biggest a misunderstanding with the word empathy is that empathy implies agreement. And empathy is, you know, when we think about negotiation, we think you have to be empathetic to what the other person's point is. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It just means you've got to, for a minute, understand where they're coming from. And I think as President Biden set from the moment of his address, from, you know, highlighting the golden rule about, you know, looking at understanding who your neighbor is. You know, I've been engaged with a project with a colleague in America for a while, looking at values-based leadership and sort of examining what we're doing a project looking at the Murrow archives and looking at the leadership at that point and sort of examining the values-based leadership. And part of that was a statement that came out that it said that remembering that the leadership is the servant, not the master of the people, and how that plays into looking at it. And to quote one of my former rabbis, Zichrono Livracha, is the former Lord Chief Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs, where he said it's remembering this dignity in difference. Not dignity in difference, but dignity in difference, and sort of learning to build community that's respectful of that. It's the social media has had a huge amount of it, and it comes to education, returning that. It's going to be dramatic need for educating from young people to understand information, to understand that power of words, to understand the differences between malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, and to be able to engage critically with what words are, accompanied by returning just basic values of respect for other. And there's a lot of work to be done, not just in the US, globally. This is it's not just a US problem. Programs like we're seeing in Finland in schools, where they're teaching children from a very young age to recognize and question quite critically sort of disinformation rhetoric, would be a really good start across many of our societies, not unique, to put the civility back into civil society.
So much, Dr. Garson and Professor Troy. I again agree with both your remarks. I think the concept of the invisible presidency is a superb image to describe all of the intricacies, the small day-to-day implications of the image of the presidency, and how significant that is both domestically but also internationally. I think it will be great to see sort of return to normalcy in a sense, and we hope that the Biden administration will be able to live up to this desire for reconciliation. I also think this idea of responding to strategic narcissism through strategic empathy is also a brilliant concept. Ultimately, foreign policy and diplomacy is grounded in values-based normative discourse, agreement from differing points of view, and one of course, the fundamental principles of the American-based multilateral world order is this type of diplomacy and this type of foreign policy. So again, I sincerely hope that the Biden administration, again, as both speakers mentioned, moves away from some of the more divisive rhetoric, both on the left and the right, and tries to project the image of a moderate, centrist, all-encompassing presidency that welcomes all sorts of American interests and protects both American power, resolve, but also respect for multilateralism and international institutions. On this note, we're going to call it an evening. We've run a bit past our designated time, but I'd like to thank our speakers today, Professor GIL TROY, Dr. MELANIE GARSON. We've had a fantastic tour de force through a variety of issues. We've talked about China, we've talked about Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq. We've talked about in great detail the Iran nuclear deal. We've discussed moving outside of the box in terms of foreign policy issues, we've also touched on some of the personalities at play who will be taking the lead of the new Biden foreign policy. So I'd like to thank everyone once again. Thank you to our participants. Thank you to our viewers. And perhaps Rabbi Brackman, would you like to say a few concluding remarks?
Okay, so I'd like to thank so much our panel for presenting tonight. This is a momentous time, new administration, U.S. administration. This event reflects how important this time is, where the world looks at America, what kind of policies it's going to be putting forward, and its implications and significance, not just for America, but for the entire world. And that's why it's important we have this discussion. And I think this is a tradition in the Chabad Society at every interval in American politics to have an in-depth discussion. And we're very grateful for JOZEF for allowing us to have this open discussion. We had this, I think, at the beginning of the Obama administration, and at the beginning of the Trump administration. And I remember very well, JOZEF said that nothing drastically will change, which I think largely has proven correct. If one can say 4 years later, the world is still standing, which we're grateful, and a lot of positive and challenges have occurred, of course. So as we celebrate also, as we mentioned at the beginning, about Jewish New Year for trees, so that's the celebration today. In a sense, a tree produces, and it produces on many branches. So in Jewish metaphor, the idea of a tree is good deeds and virtue and morality and ethics. And that's really what we look for to America and to the Western world. And as the Oxford University Chabad Society, we look at how we can make the world a better place. And we look for everything in every aspect of politics and also the world around us, how it could reflect light and peace and tolerance.